You're too stubborn to lose," said the Cheyenne woman after the cowboy refused to leave her. The rope was already looped when I hit the ground. That's how I remember it. Not the bull. I don't remember the bull until later, when somebody tells me what he weighed and what his name was and how many men he'd thrown before me. What I remember is the rope. The way it was still hanging in the air above the chute, coiled and perfect, and then I was looking up at it from the dirt, and the dirt was in my mouth, and the rope was just floating there like it had all the time in the world. My name is Del Cutter. I was 49 years old that August, and I'd been riding rough stock since I was 17, and I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I was not done. That's the first thing. I was not done, and I knew it, and every man in that arena in Prescott, Arizona knew it too, whether they said it to my face or not. Some of them were glad about what happened. Some of them weren't. But they all knew. I'd been on the circuit since before some of those young cowboys were born. Bareback, saddle bronc, bulls when I needed the money. I'd ridden at Cheyenne frontier days when the crowd still wore real hats and the horses were horses, not theater. I'd ridden at Calgary when it was still cold enough to feel like something. I'd come in second at Pendleton twice and first once, and I still have the buckle in a box somewhere in the truck, though I can't tell you exactly where right now because the truck has been accumulating things for 12 years. That's not important. What's important is that I was still riding. At 49, which is something. The bull that did it was a brindle, they told me later. Name of Undertaker. I don't remember anything about him except the sound, that particular sound of a bull leaving the chute, the gate banging and the crowd jumping up, which is different from every other sound, and you never stop hearing it different no matter how many years you're in arenas. And then I was in the air. And then I was in the dirt. My boy was there that day, Garrett. 22, built like I used to be before the years took some of that, and he'd been watching me ride since he could stand. He didn't say much when they carried me out. I remember seeing his face over somebody's shoulder, one of the medics, I think, or maybe a pickup man, and Garrett had that look he used to get when he was 8 years old and something scared him but he didn't want to show it. Jaw set, eyes moving fast. He looked so much like his mother in that moment that it hurt me somewhere that had nothing to do with my hip. His mother and I had been done for 11 years by then. That's a different story, and a shorter one than it sounds. We were better as what we were than what we tried to be, which is a sentence that took me about 5 years to be able to say without it tasting like ash. Sandra remarried. Good man, stable in Phoenix, works in insurance. Garrett likes him all right. I don't dislike him either, which is probably the most honest thing I can say about it. They took me to the hospital in Prescott, and the doctor was a young woman who had the kind of voice that means she said what she's about to say before, many times, and it no longer surprises her. She told me about the hip. She told me about the torn labrum and the fractured pelvis, and she used a word I don't remember, something medical that means the bone had moved in a way it wasn't supposed to, and she said I would need surgery. I said I knew that. She said I would need a long recovery. I said I knew that too. She said, "Mr. Cutter, do you understand what a long recovery means at your age for this kind of injury?" I told her I'd had worse. She looked at me for a moment and she said, "No, Mr. Cutter, you haven't, not like this." She was right. I knew she was right while she was saying it. I'd broken ribs before, 6 of them, different incidents, and you tape them up and ride through it. I'd broken fingers, both hands, more times than I've counted. I'd dislocated a shoulder in '97 and was back on inside of 3 weeks, which my doctor at the time said was the dumbest thing he'd seen all year, and he'd seen some things. I'd torn the MCL in my left knee and had surgery and came back. I'd had a concussion in '03 that I probably didn't handle right, if I'm being straight about it. But this was different. She was right. This was the hip itself, the ball of it and the bones around it and the whole architecture of how I moved. She told me 6 months minimum before I could think about riding. She told me the rehabilitation was not optional and was not a process I could abbreviate. She told me I needed to take the medications she was prescribing. She told me I needed someone to help me. I said I have my son. She said good, call him. I didn't call him from the hospital. I called him from the parking lot when they released me on the 4th day, and I told him I was at the hospital in Prescott and that I was coming out, and he was there in 90 minutes from Scottsdale, which tells you something about how he drove. Garrett drove me to my truck after those 4 days. They'd done the surgery and they'd told me what to do and what not to do, and I'd listened to about half of it. The other half I figured I'd work out as I went. My truck was a '68 Ford white, which I'd had for going on 12 years, and it was parked in the lot behind the arena where I'd left it 4 days before the ride. Somebody had put a note under the wiper that said "Good luck Dell" in capital letters, no name. I put it in the glove box. Garrett stood by while I got in. He didn't try to help me. He knew better than that, had learned better than that over the years, watching me. But he stood there in case I needed something, which I didn't, and when I got the door closed, he put his hands on the window frame and looked at me. He said, "Where are you going?" I said, "North." He said, "North where?" I said I hadn't decided yet. He looked at me the way you look at a man who you know is making a mistake, but who you also know you can't stop. He was his mother's son in that way too, that clear-eyed acceptance of things that can't be changed, which I've always found more deflating than anger. Anger you can push back against. Acceptance just sits there. He said, "You need to be somewhere you can do the rehab. He stopped. He had a whole speech ready, I could see the shape of it. He set it aside. He said, "You call me." I said I would. I didn't call him for 3 weeks. I drove north on Route 89 and I put Prescott behind me and I drove. I didn't have a plan. I had the prescription bottles in a paper bag and a case of water and about $200 in cash and a credit card and an open road, and that's all I needed. That's always been all I needed. The road is the one thing I have always known how to do. Point the truck at the horizon and go. Let the miles stack up. Let the country change around you. There's a kind of thinking you can only do when you're moving, and I had some thinking to do. The ponderosa pine country comes on you gradually, coming north from Prescott. The saguaro and the high desert scrub thin out and the pines start and then you're in them, and the air is different, thinner and cooler and smelling of the trees, and the sky is that particular deep blue you only get at elevation. I've always liked that country. It doesn't ask anything of you. It just is what it is. The pain medication made me stupid around hour 3. That's the only word for it. Stupid. Like thinking through warm water. I knew I needed to stop. I knew I should have stopped an hour earlier. I pulled off on a dirt road that went back through the trees because I needed to sleep and I didn't want to be on the highway when I did it, and because dirt roads have always made more sense to me than pavement when things are bad. I fell asleep before I'd been stopped 5 minutes. I slept for about 12 hours. When I woke up it was morning, and a woman was standing beside my truck looking at me through the window. She was Cheyenne. I knew that right away, not from anything she said but from the way she held herself. There's a particular stillness to Cheyenne women that I'd seen before, a way of standing that isn't unfriendly but isn't going to move for you either. She was maybe 40, maybe a few years past that, with black hair cut blunt at the jaw and dark eyes that were doing the kind of assessment you do when you're trying to decide if something is a problem or not. She was wearing a canvas work jacket over a flannel shirt, and she had a hat on, a flat-brimmed hat with a red band around the crown, and she was carrying a coffee thermos in her left hand, and she was looking at me with the particular expression of a person who has seen stranger things than a beat-up Ford on their property and is reserving judgment. She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "You're on my road." I said, "I'm sorry, I needed to sleep." She looked at the hand I had pressed against my hip. She looked at the prescription bottles on the passenger seat. She looked at the old saddle bag I'd been using as a pillow. She looked back at my face. She said, "You need something." I said, "I'm all right." She said, "I didn't ask if you were all right." I didn't have an answer for that. She unscrewed the top of the thermos and handed it through the window without asking any further questions, and I took it because I hadn't had coffee in 2 days and it smelled like something real. It was black and it was too hot, and it was the best thing I'd tasted in a week. I sat there and drank it, and she stood there and let me. Her name was Miriam Tall Horse. She told me that when I handed the thermos cap back. She'd had the land here for going on 7 years, 40 acres of ponderosa and meadow that backed up to national forest land, and a house that her grandfather had helped build in the 1940s, and a barn that needed a new roof which she was getting to. She told me all of this in the particular way that people tell you things when they've decided you're not a threat, but they want you to know where you stand. The land, the family, the rootedness. I'm telling you what this is and who I am and what you're on. I told her my name. I told her what had happened in Prescott. I told her about the surgery and the prescription bottles. She didn't make a face about any of it, and she didn't make sympathetic sounds, which I was grateful for. She just listened, and when I was done she asked if I could drive. I said I could. She said, then pull up to the house and I'll look at that hip. I said I've already been to the hospital. I had surgery 4 days ago. She said, I know what the hospital told you. Pull up to the house. I don't know why I did it. I was not a man who generally did what people told him. Ask Garrett. Ask anybody who tried to give me advice in the last 30 years. 3 ex-managers, a sports medicine doctor in Denver who I'd seen twice and refused to see again, a stock contractor in Texas who knew what he was talking about and I knew it, and still I argued. But I pulled up to the house. The house was old and it was good. That's the simplest way to say it. The logs were hand-chinked and the windows were low, the way they built them when the winters here meant something. And there was a wood stove in the main room that she'd had going since before I arrived, because the mornings at elevation in August go cold before the sun hits the meadow. She had dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, bundles of them, sage and yarrow, and something else I couldn't name then. And the smell of the place was something particular, wood smoke and something green, and something older underneath both of those. She had me sit in a chair by the stove, and she looked at my hip with her hands, not with her eyes, pressing along the bone and the muscle around the surgery site with a kind of attention that was absolutely clinical and also something more than clinical. She asked me questions about the pain, where exactly, what kind, when it was worse, when it went away, that were more specific than the questions the hospital doctor had asked. She'd been a nurse once, she said, before this. She didn't explain what she meant by before this, and I didn't ask. What she found was that I'd been moving wrong. 2 days driving and sleeping in the truck, and I'd been protecting the injury in a way that was pulling on the wrong muscles. The ones around the damaged area were tensing to compensate, putting stress on parts of the hip that were supposed to be resting. If I kept doing it, I was going to be in more trouble than the surgery itself would have caused. She showed me how to sit without loading the joint wrong. She showed me how to stand from sitting without torquing the pelvis. She showed me how to lie down and how to get up, and she had me do each of them slowly while she watched. It was humiliating. I want to be straight about that. I was a man who had ridden bucking horses for 32 years, who had stayed on 1,600-pound bulls in front of 10,000 people, who had pulled himself out of the dirt after injuries that would have kept a different man down for months. And here was a woman I'd met an hour ago showing me how to stand up from a chair. I sat there, and I let her show me, and I did not say anything, and my jaw hurt from how hard I was holding it. She saw that too. She didn't say anything about the jaw. She said, "Don't be stupid about this. Stupid will keep you from riding." I looked at her. She said, "You're going to ride again. That's clear enough about you. So don't be stupid about the recovery." That's the first time she said it. Not those words exactly, but that thing, that certainty. Like she'd already seen how this ended, and she was just waiting for me to catch up. Like the outcome wasn't in question, and the only variable was how much unnecessary suffering I was going to cause myself along the way. I thought about that later, lying in the tack room that first night. I thought, When was the last time anyone said that to me? You're going to be all right. Not asked it, said it, stated it as a fact, as something known. I couldn't remember. She let me stay in the barn that first night in the tack room, which had a cot and a wool blanket and a kerosene lamp she left burning low, and was warm enough if you didn't mind the smell of leather and horse. I didn't mind it. It was the smell of most of my life. The smell of saddles waiting to be used, of neatsfoot oil and old sweat and hay. I'd slept in worse places than that tack room. I'd slept in the back of the truck in January and in motels that smelled like carpet mold and in 2 different horse trailers on long hauls that I don't need to describe. The tack room was fine. The tack room was actually good. The second day I got up before the sun, the way I always do. The circuit trains that into you the early mornings, the pre-dawn dark before a day that'll go hard, and I did the exercises she'd shown me, slowly and in the right order in the dark outside the barn. There was a frost on the ground, light and early as frosts go, and it went silver and then disappeared as the light came up. When it was full light, I walked out to the corral to see her horses. She had 3. A gray gelding, old, probably 20 or close to it, who came to the fence when I walked up without me calling to him, just came over and put his head over the top rail and stood there. And 2 younger sorrels, mares both, who stayed back at the far side of the corral and watched me with the particular watchfulness of horses who are still deciding about something. The gray let me put my hand on his neck and didn't move, just stood there. And there's something about an old horse that's been well kept, some steadiness in them, some settled quality that I've always found settling to be near. Like they've been through their own version of things and they're not rattled by much anymore. I stood there with my hand on that horse for probably 20 minutes, not doing anything, just standing. Miriam came out of the barn with a bucket and a coffee cup she handed through the fence to me without breaking stride and said, "That's Chester. He'll stand with you all day if you let him." I said, "I don't mind that." She looked at me over the fence. She had that assessing look she'd had since the first morning, but warmer now, like she was adding information to something she'd already started building. She said, "How long have you been riding?" I said, "Since I was 17. She said, "And yours?" She looked at me. 50. I said, 49, don't push it. She looked at something that was almost a smile. She said, 32 years. She wasn't doing the math out loud for my benefit. She was just saying it back to me, sitting with it. I said, "Yes." She said, "And this is the worst you've been hurt?" It wasn't a question. I said, "Yes." She went into the corral without saying anything else, and I watched her move around those sorrels, patient and particular, not rushing anything, and the horses settled immediately around her the way horses settle around certain people, not broken, just quiet. She had that quality with horses that she had with everything else. Unhurried, intentional, nothing wasted. After a while she came back out and latched the gate and she said, "There's more coffee on the stove. Come in and have some, it's cold." That was how it went for the first few days. I stayed in the tack room. I did my exercises before daylight. I helped with what I could help with, which wasn't much at first, a few minutes at the fence with the horses. Some light work she let me do with Chester, because walking with him wasn't hard on the hip if I kept my pace slow. She was careful about what she let me do in those first days, and I learned quick that arguing with her about it was a waste of breath. She'd look at me with those dark eyes and she'd say, "Not that one," and that would be the end of it. I hated it. I want to be honest. I hated being told what I could and couldn't do, hated the limits, hated needing the prescription bottles, hated waking in the night when the pain spiked and lying there in the dark in the tack room waiting for the medication to bring it back down. I hated being slow. I'd been slow once before in my life, after the shoulder surgery in '97, and I'd shortened that recovery by about 2 weeks through sheer refusal to comply, which my doctor told me was stupid, and which I told my doctor was efficient, and we disagreed. But the hip was something different. The hip didn't allow for that kind of negotiation. The hip was just the truth of it. I called Garrett on the 4th day. I told him I was somewhere in the high country north of Prescott and that I was all right. He asked where exactly. I said I'd let him know when I knew better. He said, "Dad." That's all he said, just that one word, and there was a whole conversation in it, worry and frustration and love and the particular helplessness of watching your father be your father. I said, "I know." I said, "I'll call you." I hung up before he could say anything else. I didn't call him for another 2 weeks after that. Here is something I have not told many people. The day I hit the dirt in Prescott, before they got to me, before Garrett's face and the medic and all of it, there was a moment. A still moment, flat on my back with the rope above me and the bulls somewhere behind the fence and the crowd noise coming through like it was on the other side of water. A moment where it was very quiet. And in that moment I thought, that's it. Not death. I want to be clear about that. I didn't think I was dying. I've been hurt enough times to know the difference between bad hurt and that other thing, and this was bad hurt, serious hurt, but not that. What I thought was, I thought I was finished. Not the body, not life. The thing I'd spent 32 years doing. I thought, that was the last ride. And it wasn't good enough. I'd been bucked off in the well under 4 seconds, which is not how you want to go out, and everything after this is just time, just waiting around. I'd had that thought before, in smaller ways, for about 3 years. Every time the season ended and I looked at the placings, and I was lower than I'd been the year before. Every time I saw a young cowboy ride something I'd ridden 10 years ago, and do it cleaner than I'd done it, with better form, the natural ease of a man in his prime. Every time Garrett looked at me with that careful look that meant he was worried but didn't know how to say it in a way I'd hear. Every time I got in the truck at the end of a circuit stop and drove to the next one and the road looked the same, and the arenas looked the same, and I felt not tired of it. I was never tired of it, but like something was narrowing. The thought had been coming closer for a while, like weather moving in from the west, and in the dirt in Prescott it arrived. What I'm telling you is, I didn't go north just because I needed to sleep. I went north because I didn't know where else to go. I didn't want to go to Scottsdale and be near Garrett, where he could see me not knowing what I was. I didn't want to go to the motels I usually stayed in, the circuit motels, where other cowboys would find me and ask about the injury, and I'd have to perform being fine when I wasn't. I didn't want to go anywhere I'd been before. I wanted to go somewhere that had no information about me yet. Somewhere that would just let me be whatever I was going to be. And somewhere along Route 89, with the medication making me slow and the pines coming in, I turned onto a dirt road that belonged to a woman I'd never met. Miriam knew all of this. I didn't tell her any of it. She knew it anyway. I know she knew it because of what she said on about the 8th day. I was out at the fence line with a pair of fence pliers doing what I could manage, which wasn't much. She'd let me work this stretch because the ground was level, and I could do it standing mostly still, moving every few posts. And she came up beside me in the late afternoon without announcing herself, which I'd noticed was how she moved, and we stood there for a while watching the light go off the meadow. The sky was going yellow and amber behind the pines, and there were swallows working the air above the grass, catching whatever was flying up from the meadow in the warmth. We stood there for probably 5 minutes without saying anything, and then she said, "You came up here to quit." I didn't say anything. She said, "I'm not asking. I'm telling you what I see." I said, "I came up here because I got hurt." She said, "Men get hurt and they go home. You don't have a home to go to." That landed hard. Not mean, she didn't say it mean. Just plain. The way you say something that's simply true and doesn't need softening. I said, "I have my truck." She said, "That's not the same thing and you know it." I put the fence pliers down on the top of a post and I looked out at the meadow. There were 2 mule deer out at the tree line, a doe and a yearling, moving along the edge of the pines, going about their particular business. I said, "I don't know how to be done. I've been riding since I was 17 years old. I don't know what I look like without that. I don't know what the rest of it looks like, or what I'm good for, Or I stopped because I was saying more than I'd planned to. She was quiet for a moment. The deer moved into the trees. She said, "Who said anything about being done?" I looked at her. She said, "The doctor told you 6 months. You've been on the circuit 32 years. 6 months is nothing." I said, "I'm 49. She said, "I know how old you are." She said my name and it sounded like something else. Like she'd been saying it for a long time already. Not like a stranger saying a name, like something more practiced than that. She said, "I've seen men quit because they were finished, and I've seen men quit because they were scared. Those are two different things. You're not finished. You're scared." I opened my mouth. She held up a hand, not impolitely, "Just wait." She said, "Don't tell me you're not scared. Of course you're scared. That bull was 1,200 pounds and he rearranged your hip, and you've been lying in a tack room for a week letting the pain medication and the quiet tell you that was the end of it. That's not being finished. That's being scared and letting the quiet make the decision for you." I stood there with my hand on the fence post. She said, "Pick up those pliers and finish the fence, and tomorrow we start working the hip harder." I picked up the pliers. 6 weeks I was there. I want to be honest about what those 6 weeks were and were not. They were not a romance, not at first, not in any way I'd know how to name if someone asked me to. Miriam Tallhorse was not a woman who moved fast toward anything. She moved at her own pace and she let things be what they were, and she didn't perform anything. What those weeks were was work, recovery, the particular intimacy, and there is an intimacy to it, even when nothing is said, of one person watching another person learn how to move again. She knew things about the body that I didn't. Things she'd learned nursing, in the hospitals in Phoenix, and then in Denver, and then back here, and things she'd learned before that, from her grandmother who had been a healer in the way her people had been healers, and she didn't separate those two kinds of knowledge in any way I could see. She treated them both like they were part of the same understanding. She'd have me do the physical therapy exercises, the specific clinical ones, the ones from the hospital sheet that I'd been half doing, and then she'd have me sit and be still for 20 minutes, and she'd put her hands on my shoulders from behind and she'd just be quiet. And I don't know what that was exactly, what you'd call it, but I know that afterward the pain was different. Not gone. Different. Less sharp and more bearable, like something that had been knotted up had loosened. I didn't ask about it. Some things you just take. I fixed her fence. I fixed a hinge on the barn door that had been working loose for a while, she said, and every time someone pushed it the whole door shuddered, which bothered her. I split wood starting in the 3rd week because I could do that standing with the right technique, working slowly, and she let me because she could see it was something real to do with my hands and that I needed that. I watched her with her horses every morning and I started learning the sorrels. Their names were June and Cora, both 4 years old, both green but willing. And after a while Miriam started letting me help with them, standing at the rail and talking me through what she wanted me to do, and it was the right pace for the hip because it was slow and particular. Chester was always there. Chester was a horse who had decided that companionship was the whole point, and he spent a lot of that 6 weeks wherever I was, which turned out to be a considerable comfort. There's something about a horse who's just decided you're okay. You don't have to earn it every morning. You're just okay. Garrett drove up in the 3rd week. I hadn't told him exactly where I was, but he was smart, and he'd had enough from the early phone call to track me to the general area. And from there, he'd asked around. A thing Garrett was good at, asking around. He had his mother's way of getting people to help him, and I saw his truck coming up the dirt road in the afternoon light. He got out and stood in the yard and looked at me, and I could see him doing the same inventory he'd done the day they carried me out of the arena. He looked at how I was standing. He looked at how I was moving. He looked at my face and at whatever my face was doing. And then he looked at the house and the barn and the meadow, and then back at me. He said, "You look better." I said, "I feel better." He said, "Who lives here?" I said, "A woman named Miriam. She's been helping me with the recovery." He said, "You've been here 3 weeks, and you didn't say where exactly." I said, "I know." He said, "Should I be worried?" I said, "No." He stood there for a moment longer, looking at me with that careful look, and then he nodded, once, the way his grandfather used to nod. A thing I hadn't seen until Garrett was about 15 or 16, and it showed up in him. This particular nod that was my father's, that meant, "All right, I've taken this in. We can continue." Something in me always moved when I saw it. He said, "You coming back to the circuit?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You sure?" I said, I am sure." He looked at me for another moment, and I think he believed it, because whatever I was projecting in that yard was different from what I'd been when he'd last seen me. And he was a good reader of people, always had been, like his mother. He stayed for dinner. Miriam made venison she dried herself, reconstituted in a stew with dried chilies and something from the garden that I thought was winter squash, and cornbread in a cast iron pan. The three of us sat at the table in the lamplight. She cooked by lamplight most evenings, an old habit she'd kept, and Garrett was quiet at first, the way young men are quiet when they're in the presence of something they don't quite understand yet. Not uncomfortable, just observing. But by the end of the meal he'd asked her 3 or 4 things about the land and the horses and the history of this part of the country, and she'd answered them straight and with specificity, and without performing any of it, and I could see him recalibrating her. I could see him seeing what I'd been seeing. He left after dinner. He shook my hand and then pulled me in for a hug, something he didn't always do, something that still occasionally surprised me, though it shouldn't by now, and he said, "Call me more." I said, "I will." He looked back at the house. He said, "She's something, isn't she?" I said, "Yes, she is." He got in his truck and drove down the road, and I stood there in the yard in the evening air and watched his taillights go, and then I went back inside. It was the 4th week when things shifted between us. Not suddenly. Nothing sudden about any of it, but in the 4th week something that had been implicit became something else. I don't know exactly what shifted or why that week rather than some other week. Maybe it was just the accumulation of days, the weight of that much time together in that particular kind of closeness, eating at the same table, working the same ground, sitting on the same porch in the evenings. Maybe it was the particular evening, the way the light was coming off the meadow after rain, everything washed and still, the smell of wet pine coming through the open door. Maybe it was the way she laughed. She had a laugh that didn't come out often, and when it did it surprised you, because it was nothing like her ordinary way of being. Ordinary, she was composed, measured, nothing wasted. The laugh was sudden and unguarded, and it made her look 10 years younger, and it made the whole yard feel different somehow, like the air pressure changed slightly. We were sitting on the porch after dinner with coffee, and I'd been telling her about a rodeo in Texas in 1991, where a young cowboy kid from Oklahoma, first real circuit season, had gotten his spur caught on a bareback horse, and instead of coming off clean he'd gone halfway around the arena, just hanging upside down from the one spur, horse running full tilt. The kid's hat long gone, his face going red, the crowd half horrified and half dying laughing. Until the horse finally slowed down enough that the kid just sort of folded to the dirt, unhurt, got up, looked up at the crowd from below with an expression like a man who has reconsidered his life choices. She laughed like that, out of nowhere, sudden and real. I looked at her and she looked at me, and neither of us said anything. After a while she said, "You're a different man than you were when you came up that road." I said, "Am I?" She said, "You were trying to disappear. You're not trying to do that anymore." I said, "I wasn't trying to disappear." She looked at me. I said, "All right, maybe a little." She said, "You came up here to become nothing, to let the road and the pills and the quiet make the decision for you so you didn't have to make it yourself." I said, "When you say it that way it sounds worse than it was." She said, "It was about as bad as it sounds, and you stopped doing it. I just want you to know I saw that I saw you turn around." There was a quiet, a good quiet. The kind that happens between people when something true has been said, and there's nothing to add to it, and neither person is trying to add to it. I said you didn't just let me recover, you pulled me out. She didn't say anything. I said you didn't know me. You found me sleeping in my truck on your road. You could have told me to leave and had every right to. She said I thought about it. I said what made you not? She looked out at the meadow. The light was going now, the pines going dark at the far edge, the meadow holding the last of it, that particular golden light that happens for about 10 minutes at the end of a clear evening in the high country. She said, you looked like a man who'd fallen down a long way and was too stubborn to stay down. That's a certain kind of man. I've got some time for that kind of man. I said stubborn. She said, is that wrong? I said no, that's about right, that's about as right as it gets. She looked at me and the meadow was going dark behind her and the kerosene lamp was going through the window. She said, there are men who fall and don't get up. There are men who fall and someone has to carry them the whole way. And then there are men who fall and fight the whole way back and make it miserable for everyone involved and don't say thank you enough. You're that kind. I said the worst kind sounds like. She said, it's the kind that gets back on. I said, Miriam. She said, yes. I said, I don't know what to do with this. I want to be honest with you. I don't know what to do with what's happened here or with you or with any of it. I've been married and I've been done with that for 11 years and I've been on the road since. And I don't know how a man like me, at this point in his life, I don't know how I fit into something that isn't the road. I've been the road for a long time. She said, I'm not asking you to stop being the road. I said, what are you asking? She said, I'm not asking anything. I'm telling you that you came up here trying to be nothing and you're not nothing. That's a fact whether you leave or stay. And I'm telling you she stopped. She looked at her coffee cup. She said, I'm telling you that I would not be against you coming back, after your season, if you wanted to. It was the most and the least she'd said. It sat there between us in the evening air and I let it sit. I didn't fill it up with words. I've done that before in my life, filled up things that should have been left alone with words, and it hadn't served me. So I sat with it. I said, you'd have me come back. She said, I'd have you come back. I said, why? She looked at me then with a look I'm not going to try to describe in detail, except to say it was the kind of look that hits you somewhere behind the breastbone, somewhere you didn't know was still capable of being hit. Dark eyes in the last of the light, something clear in them, nothing performed. She said, because you're too stubborn to lose. That's a thing worth keeping around. I left in the morning of the 42nd day. I got up before the sun, the way I always do, and I did my exercises in the dark outside the barn. The complete set. All of them in order, the way she drilled it into me. Chester was at the fence, and he saw me come out of the barn, and he put his head over the top rail, and I went over and stood with him in the dark the way I'd done most mornings for 6 weeks. The morning was cold, sharp cold, the kind that comes early even at the end of August at elevation, and the frost was on the meadow grass. When the sun started coming up behind the pines, the frost went silver and then gold and then it was gone, the grass just grass again, and it was one of the better things I'd seen in a long time. Simple and good. She came out when she heard me moving the truck around. She had 2 cups of coffee, and she handed me one, and we stood there looking at the meadow in the early light. She said, hip's good. I said, hip's good, better every week. She said, you'll do the exercises, every day, not most days. I said, I'll do the exercises. She said, you call Garrett, not 3 weeks between calls, he worries. I said, I'll call Garrett. She said, and you eat. You get thin on the circuit, you look thinner than you should, eat. I said, I'll eat. We were quiet for a moment. The meadow was bright now. June and Cora were moving at the back of the pasture, and Chester was still at the fence watching me with those old patient eyes. I said, Miriam. She said, "Don't say something you're going to make small." I stopped. She was right. I was about to say something that would have been less than what it should have been. Some cowboy version of gratitude that would have come out practical and understated, and wouldn't have touched the actual thing. She said, "Just remember what you are, what you came back to, and come back here after." I looked at her. The morning light was coming up behind her, and there was frost in the grass, and her hat was the one with the red band, and she was looking up at me with those eyes, and I thought a number of things that I didn't say. I thought, this is a woman who found a man at the edge of himself and decided he was worth the trouble, who didn't ask to do that, who didn't owe it to me, who did it because she saw something worth pulling back. I thought, this is what it looks like when someone decides you're not finished. I didn't say any of that. I finished my coffee. I handed her the cup, and she took a step toward me and she put her hand flat on my chest, not a hug, not a kiss, just her hand on my chest over the shirt, looking up at me, steady as anything, and she said, "Go ride." I got in the truck. I went down the dirt road to the highway. I did not look in the mirror because I knew if I looked in the mirror I'd stop the truck, and I wasn't supposed to stop the truck. She told me what I was, and I was going to go be it. I rode at Tucson in October. My hip held. I didn't win, I'll tell you that straight. I placed 5th out of 11 in the saddle bronc, and I didn't even place in the bareback. But I rode clean in both, and I stayed on, and the crowd made that sound, that particular low wave of a sound, and I heard it, and I thought, there it is. There it is. I did the exercises every morning and every evening in the motel rooms. I ate. I called Garrett 3 times that month. There were 2 more rides that fall, and I placed in both of them. Tucson, and then Albuquerque, and then Las Cruces. Nothing dramatic in any of it, nothing that was going to end up in any record books. But I was on the board, and I was riding clean, and the hip was getting stronger, and the thing in me that had been going sideways, that narrowing I'd been feeling for 3 years, that incoming weather was different now. It wasn't gone, but it had a different quality, less like an ending and more like just what things were, the natural difficulty of a thing worth doing. Garrett was at Tucson. He watched from behind the chute like he always did, back in the shadows where he could see without being seen, and afterward he said, "That was good, Dad." He doesn't use that word loosely. I've heard him say it 6, maybe 7 times in 22 years, and every time it's meant something specific. I said, "I had some help." He said, "I know." He already knew what I meant. I drove back north in November, after Las Cruces. Snow in the Ponderosas by then, the road into her place rutted and packed with the early season, the tracks of her truck going in and out in the mud at the turnoff. The trees were heavy with it, and the light was that flat white winter light that makes everything look still. I could see smoke from the chimney before I could see the house through the trees, which I'd thought about once or twice out on the road, in the motel rooms in the evenings, that smoke. The specific image of it. Chester was at the fence. He heard the truck before I was all the way up the road, and by the time I parked he was at the gate, head over the rail, making that low sound. I went over and stood with him for a minute before I did anything else, my hand on his neck, the old horse warm against the cold air. Miriam came out of the house and down the porch steps and across the yard to where I was standing. She looked at me the way she'd looked at me the first morning, that full inventory, nothing missed. She looked at how I moved getting down from the truck. She looked at how I was holding myself. She looked at my face and whatever she was reading there. She said, "Well." I said, "Well." She said, "You rode." I said, "I rode." She had that assessing look for another moment, and then it went to something else, something quieter and warmer. She came across the yard and she stood in front of me and she looked up at me, and she put her hand on my jaw the way someone does when they want to be sure of something, when they want to feel the truth of it under their hand. Her hand was cold from the air, and it was the realest thing I'd felt in months. She said, "You look like yourself." I said, "I feel like myself." She said, "Come in, there's food on." I followed her inside. The stove was going. The herbs were still hanging from the ceiling, and the lamplight was the same lamplight, and the smell of the place was the same, wood smoke and green, and that older thing underneath that I'd stopped trying to name and just let be. I sat down in the same chair I'd sat in the first morning, and she handed me coffee without asking. I thought about what I'd been when I came up this road the first time, sleeping in the truck with the prescription bottles on the seat and the rope still floating somewhere behind my eyes. I thought about the tack room and the cold mornings and Chester at the fence and the slow weeks of learning to move right again, and the evening on the porch when she'd said you're too stubborn to lose, and what that had done somewhere in me that I didn't have a name for. I thought about Tucson and the sound the crowd made in Garrett behind the chute. I thought about all of it sitting in a straight line like fence posts going back across the prairie. Outside the window, the snow was coming in off the mountains, light and steady and even. She sat across from me with her own coffee, and she was looking at me. That look she had, like she was reading something she'd been reading for a while now, and she was getting to a part she'd been waiting for. The fire in the stove made a sound. Chester was visible through the window, out at the fence in the snow, standing still, not going anywhere. She said, "You'll stay through winter." It wasn't a question. I said yes. She looked at me for another moment, and there was something in her eyes that was almost amusement, and was also something warmer than that, deeper than that, the kind of thing that takes time to arrive and doesn't announce itself. She said, "There's the tack room, or theirs." I said, "I know." She said, "You know what I was going to say." I said, "Yes." She held that look on me, said, "Then say it." I said, "I'll stay in the house." The fire made a sound. The snow came down on the meadow and on the pines and on Chester at the fence, patient and still. She said, "All right." She said my name, and it sounded like something permanent, like something that had been there a while and would be there a while yet. That's it, that's all of it. There isn't a moral, and I'm not going to tie it up for you, make it go anywhere it didn't go. I'll tell you this. In the spring I went back on the circuit, and in the fall I came back north, and I kept doing that for the years that followed. I rode until I was 53, and then I stopped because the hip said it was time, and I listened to the hip, which was probably the first time in my life I'd listened to something that had good sense without arguing first. She was there when I came back. I was there when I came back. Chester was there until he wasn't, and when he went she took it quiet and hard, the way she took most things, and I stayed through that with her the way she'd stayed through things with me. The tack room stayed a tack room. I don't know that I ever fully told her what those 6 weeks meant, what she pulled me back from. Some things you don't say out loud because saying them changes their shape, makes them smaller than they are, or makes the person who did the thing feel like they have to respond, and there isn't really a response to it. Some things you just carry. What I know is this: there are men who fall down and they stay down, and there are men who fall down and a good woman decides they're worth the trouble, decides it for her own reasons that may not have anything to do with you, and she doesn't let them. I was 49 years old in the dirt in Prescott with the rope still floating and everything that came after happened, because a Cheyenne woman on a dirt road in the high country looked at a broken cowboy in a truck with a paper bag full of prescription bottles, and decided not to tell him to leave. That's the whole story. That's enough.